Thank you all so much for joining, and it's great to be here. Today, I'm gonna, yeah, as Thomas said, I will run through harnessing community approaches to audiovisual verification. So I'll talk a bit about our work at Witness and spotlight a few of our partners' projects, and then talk about the challenges, but also the solutions, and then opportunities that we see at Witness that there is right now within this information ecosystem, to really like build community-led solutions, and really like harness those approaches as we discuss how the institutionalization of open source investigations and the field is emerging as a whole. So yeah, please just if you have any questions during my discussion, also we'll wait for the discussion at the end. So firstly about Witness. So Witness is a global human rights organization which helps people to use video and technology to protect and defend human rights. So in this age, it's really thinking about how to support journalists, activists, and frontline defenders to protect what is real, but also detect what is fake. And that has become increasingly difficult in the information ecosystem saturated by AI. So I'm in the evidence and investigations team, and I collaborate with documenters and journalists and legal practitioners on not just the capturing of video, but also the verification, the analysis and presentation. So at Witness, we talk about the justice pipeline. So it's really thinking about how to support documenters, move that documentation from capture through verification analysis to be presented for justice and accountability, depending on what that means to the partner we work with. And so you might be aware of the video as evidence guide at Witness. So that's a critical part of Witness's work, which was really came out of how to train activists and frontline defenders to use video to meet the threshold of evidence to be able to be used in justice and accountability processes. But now, as we know that video does play a critical role in visual evidence, and so evidence and investigations at Witness is really thinking about um, uh, how to sort out the challenges which are around the rigorous standards of proof, the increasing amount and the abundance of visual evidence and user-generated evidence in the public domain, but also thinking about the standards of proof, especially as the rise of synthetic media. So firstly, before we go into like thinking about the institutionalization of this field, you everyone who is watching this is probably has a bit of an awareness of open source information, so information that is publicly available and can be used in investigations. But as we go through the timeline of how open source information, open source intelligence has been used, which charted from it being used largely by states and by militaries when there wasn't a democratization of having technology available to the public to use them. So it was really technology that was used by powerful actors, we could say, for surveillance, as they were the ones that really held that technology. But then as time went on, and more people had cameras and smartphones, and there were more the proliferation of smartphones and cameras. So this photo on the left is taken from the Syrian revolution. So the Arab Spring was really the first time when we saw um, videos of human rights violations becoming in the public domain. And then as time went on, there was really a drive to think about, I guess, our field, to think about how to harness and use these videos and user-generated videos as evidence, and how do we transfer that data from being in the public domain to actually being an institutionalized field that is effective at doing that. And one of the things was the Digital Amnesty International Digital Verification Corps, which was created in 2016 to respond to like rising authoritarianism, but also harnessing and trying to train people in using audiovisual information that's in the public domain. And then also the Berkeley Protocol, which Witness was were supported in reviewing, and that was really the first protocol and the first guide on how to create standards of using open source material in accountability and justice processes. And that brought critical and groundbreaking successes in terms of like really establishing a field where that is possible. And one thing that we have looked at as this field has emerged at Witness particularly is while there has been these like real successes in the institutionalization of it, but we've also looked at how, as this has happened, there has been a shift of agency away from the photos and the videos where they were first taken and into the hands of the institutions that where these like standards are created. And so this will look at like how this institutionalization and how we can kind of like harness community approaches, which I'll go into a bit later. So yeah, this is the article written by my colleague Adebayo Okeowo and Rebecca Hamilton, which says on account of being directed towards meeting the legal standards of international accountability mechanisms, professionalization efforts began to pull the center of gravity back from the local communities from which user-generated evidence first emerged towards global north centers of expertise. So the work that Witness has done is really thinking about how we pull that center of gravity back to the local communities that we center and support in our work. So the institutionalization is also facing other challenges, and I think we all can be really aware of what they are in our work. So other emerging challenges are even though technology has become a lot better and how more and more people are using smartphones and videos and cameras. The states and powerful actors too have also responded by using technology to reinforce harmful narratives. So this is an example on the left of the Nigerian army in after the 2020 NSARS protests, where in response to many protesters filming how the Nigerian army fired directly at protesters, the Nigerian army responded with like many tweets just saying fake news, discrediting the protesters, events the protesters saw with their own eyes. And we're only seeing this more and more sophisticatedly from actors around the world as technology has increased. And then secondly, also how as the open source field emerges, and these methodologies have been widely seen as more and more credible, how states are actually responding and emulating the same analysis or the same methodologies and frameworks that are being used, as was seen, for example, with like the recent Israeli Defense Forces and like they there were this investigation, the 972 magazine found that they were using the same methods to seem as credible, but actually underneath, they were found to have been taking data from, like, for example, the Scottish Maritime Museum. And then, secondly, there's not just technology, but also weaponizing AI. So, as more and more synthetic media has become more convincing, and there's also a need for fast verification in newsrooms, particularly in the rise of visual investigative units, there have been instances where fake videos are being verified as real. So, for example, this is a video that the IDF posted on social media that was of their airstrike on the Evin prison. And then that was circulated and verified by multiple newsrooms around the world. And then also around how perpetrators are using AI to spread doubt, which essentially feeds into the hands of the perpetrators themselves. So this is an article, How Doubt Became a Weapon in Iran by my colleague Masa Ali Madani, which was written to show how in the recent Iran protests, then there have been many like edited or altered images which have been shared by official sources. So, for example, this video, whilst this is a real event that really did happen, it was shared by this person, which they then realized that they'd actually shared the altered image, which has then also been shared by the Persian language accounts of the US State Department and the Israeli Foreign Ministry. So it's just showing how when no one knows what to believe, no one knows, yeah, when no one knows what to believe, it really feeds into the hands of the perpetrators themselves, and it is being increasingly seen as a weapon. Okay, and then thinking about challenges faced by communities using OSINT, this is what we've seen through our work by working around the world at Witness. So, for example, OSINT is the language of the West. So, really thinking back to the background of OSINT and thinking about how we can develop this field, but in a non-extractive way and in a way which isn't emulating that of the militaries themselves, for example. Also, access to data that's skewed in the global north. So I think we all probably know as in this field that there is a really a discrepancy of data, which means that some tools and techniques are just not suitable within certain areas of the global majority. So it's really thinking about how do you develop a field that is really equitable in its practices and tools. And then also, we've seen tensions in relation to using like institutional platforms that we know are extractive and exploitive to do our work. So, for example, we worked in we work on Escuela Común, which is a technology school in Latin America, where we built an OSINT training, which was only using open and free software following the Latin American like, free software movement. So that's really thinking about the tensions that are associated with that. So, for example, obviously, if everyone was using OpenStreetMaps would be a lot better, but that's not the reality that we have today. So, how do you balance the need for investigative work with using those platforms that we know to be exploitative? And then lastly, thinking about how the burden of proof. So we are thinking about how with how like as the field emerged and the institutionalization of the field has been so critical and important. But how do we do this without raising the burden of proof for frontline activists anymore? So we've had questions around, do I have to become a 3D designer to be believed? Like, why isn't my own eyes or my own testimony enough? So this is really thinking about what are legible forms of evidence and how do we ensure that we're not raising the burden of proof anymore through this work. And so that leads us to Witness's community-based approach to visual verification, which really came out of these challenges and thinking about the challenges also within the information ecosystem as states and perpetrators are also often using the same technology but to inflict harm. So we were thinking about how to build an approach which centers the knowledge and skills of local experts and community members, combined and complemented by accessible tools to verify the accuracy, reliability, and credibility of open source visual content. So that's really thinking about rather than focusing on open source investigations, is how can we use those skills to really complement local context and social networks that are already there. And so now we go into solutions. So while we've been doing this work for years at Witness, we've worked with some really amazing partners that have built community-led solutions that we think are really critical in terms of the work in this field. So firstly, we have MobWatch, which is led by Opeyemi Lawal, who's also on this call today. And MobWatch is a web platform and an archive which has where she's built a methodology which is capable of understanding the pattern of harm of mob violence in Nigeria. And mob violence is a prevalent form of harm that is when a person is attacked by a group of people without any form of any right to a fair trial, for example. But it's really crucial that this methodology was able to expose patterns that OSINT often is able to do, which weren't previously understood or recognized by the state in a key call for to advocate for police reform. And this methodology was able can now work with groups like Casualty Recorders Network to develop and support other regions to monitor mob violence as well. So it's really thinking about how methodologies are able to be built to be scalable, and that can also be emulated in different regions. And then secondly, we've been recently been working with the Bangladesh Protest Archive, which is a collaboration between Witness and Activate Rights, which came out of the 2024 July uprising in Bangladesh, which deposed the former authoritarian government. The Bangladesh Protest Archive has built a video archive of over 1,500 videos of violence against civilians by the police and state military forces. And they have developed a community-based workflow, which involves many different steps, but including giving community the right to reply. So really thinking about how to involve the community in every aspect of their workflow, which not only makes it more credible because they have direct testimony based on all of their to corroborate all of their video, but it's also involving the community in that way as well. And then also, they recently and have been working with Netra News, which is a Bangladeshi investigative outlet, which is and the long-term partnership that has been developed is really thinking about how Bangladesh Protest Archive builds the archive of video footage, analyzes it, verifies the footage, but then how to create a partnership which streamlines that footage into the hands of investigators to build investigations of the incidents of the protests. And then they're also working together to really think about how that could be streamlined and work on other forms of and patterns of violence, not just violence out of the protests. And these investigations have featured as part of the ongoing International Criminal Tribunal as well. And recently, we also have been working alongside Bangladesh Protest Archive and with Air Wars to really think about how Air Wars can adapt their code book, so the way that they model their data to fit in with the way that the Bangladesh Protest Archive can also support modeling their data. And I know that Air Wars, which is a civilian casualty monitoring organization based in London, they're really thinking about how the describing patterns of harm is really, really important, and how the different levels and the different ways that people catalog or categorize harm often really it depends on maybe the outcome, for example. So it's like the question is, how do we get community footage or community evidence to be seen as the same as like a really established or an institution, for example. And so one way is thinking about if there was a shared code book between many organizations, then that would be described in the same way. So that's the work to really adapt that code book to have a shared terms and values across human rights documenting organizations. Okay, and then finally, opportunities that we see at Witness to really foreground these community-led approaches. So how do we build these community-led approaches using these innovative ways like the Bangladesh Protest Archive partnership with investigators, for example. So we see that the rise in visual investigative units globally brings a huge opportunity to promote more community filmed footage. So is there a way of streamlining like the approach that Netra News and Bangladesh Protest Archive have done, but on a wider scale, for example? And also there'll then be an increased credibility in community filmed footage because these visual investigations follow principles of OSINT which are credible, such as transparency, that many other forms of journalism are used to, for example, like using secret sources. That doesn't happen in visual investigations. And then secondly, the rise in innovative global journalism models and collaborative labs. So there's more independent newsrooms which have innovative models for accountability journalism with more meaningful partnerships with community partners. But also, university labs can offer burden lifting support for community-based investigation. So, as we said, for example, we don't recommend or advise that every activist we work with should learn how to be a 3D designer. But what if there are 3D designers working in universities who then can partner with activists that we work with to build investigations? So it's really these like innovative models that we've seen, for example, by partnering with Utrecht University in a really, really successful way. Um, and then finally, also the growth of global majority visual investigative newsrooms and investigative agencies. So the growth of accountability journalism, but where keep agency within the context where a lot of user-generated content often first emerged. So whilst we would like to also, yeah, increase the streamline and the ability of community filmed footage to be in existing international visual investigative units, how do you keep the narrative and really within the context of where user-generated content often first emerged and build these robust counter narratives, as we've seen, for example, with the Daily Nation that Witness have worked with closely with Mike Gambo, an OSINT investigator there, who has been building the visual forensics unit at Nation in a way which has been really powerful because it's been able to build cross-border investigations that are really holding the state to accountable, particularly at a time where there is a lot of lack of faith within traditional justice institutions. And so that leads me to the final provocations that I hope we could talk about today. So the first one is around harnessing these approaches. So how can we harness these approaches and streamline this pipeline between community filmed footage, foreground narratives crucially within existing visual investigative units? And then the second one is around promoting the ability of community methodologies to be credible evidence. So how do we not raise the burden of proof any further, especially when like powerful actors are weaponizing AI, but also everyone's becoming more confused about whether things are real or not. And then thirdly, looking at how to prioritize the development of visual investigative units in global majority newsrooms. And prioritizing the development in global majority might mean deprioritizing the development in the global north, for example. So how would that actually be done, and is that possible to do? And how then could we also increase innovative international partnerships as well? And I know that we have Opiemi Lawal in the room who built MobWatch, so please, in your discussion, do direct any questions about MobWatch at her as well. But yeah, thank you so much for listening.